Okay, we are live. Good morning to you all and a very warm welcome. I'm very happy to have Dr. Swati Moitra today with us. She'll be speaking on reading for pleasure, women, and the book trade in colonial Bengal. Before she starts, a very brief introduction. Dr. Moitra is an assistant professor at the Department of English at Gurudas College in Kolkata. Her areas of interest include book history, histories of readership, and digital and internet cultures. She is a 2022 recipient of the Sharp Research Development Grant. Thank you so much, Dr. Moitra, and over to you.
Right. Thank you so much, Shanchali. I hope I'm audible here. My mic setup should be okay.
Yes, you're
I'm
audible.
very, very grateful to you for asking me to be a part of this wonderful curated series of yours, which I followed with interest in the recent past. I am honored to be a small part of this, and I'm glad that you've given me the opportunity to talk about my recent preoccupation. No, to be fair, this has been a preoccupation for a while now. Now, this discussion titled Reading for Pleasure, Women and the Book Trade in Colonial Bengal is somewhat of a misnomer in the sense that I'm unfortunately not going to be able to talk as much about the book trade and its dynamics as much as I'd wanted to. I've kept the discussion at around 40 to 45 minutes, and there's only so much that one can talk about in such a discussion. Part of this work is part of my doctoral project, while some of it is more recent and um, will hopefully be published in the near future. It's I'm going to talk about the construction of the female reader, the ideal female reader, and the questions surrounding the same. I'll center my discussion around one advice manual in particular, though it will feature into our discussion much later, not right now. What we're going to talk about will start straight away, and I hope the screen is visible to you. I'll start with a quotation, which should be on your screen as well. So this is from Pather Pachali, or The Song of the Road by Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay. Um, it goes like this. He borrows a book from the bookshelf every afternoon from Shotu and reads them in the shade of the bamboo grove on his makeshift bed made out of soft sheora branches. There are so many books. Pronoy Pratima, or The Portrait of Love, Sharoj Sarojini, Kusum Kumari, Sachitra Joubone Jogini Natok, or the illustrated youthful yogini play, Doshu Duhita, The Bandit's Daughter, Prem Porinam or Amrite Goron, The Result of Love, or The Poisoned Elixir, Gopeshwarer Gupta Katha, The Secrets of Gopeshwar. There's no end to titles. He starts one and reads till the very end. His eyes begin to strain, his head hurts. He barely notices when the shadow of the bamboo groves descend upon the mossy edges of the pond. Now, this is Opu, the protagonist of the iconic Pather Pachali, published in 1929. The novel and its sequel weaves through the journey of an impoverished young man, a Brahmin, it should be noted. It weaves through the Bildungsroman style, armed with his imagination and his indistinguishable desire to know the world. It is quite beyond the scope of this discussion to engage with the dynamics of caste and class that mark Opu's journey in pre independence India, making him one of the most memorable protagonists of Bengali literature. I will point instead to Opu the reader, with whom I began. Opu reads. Young Opu reads like a starving man in a famine, poring upon every scrap of paper available to him in his village. He reads old copies of the magazines Probashi and Bongobashi. He begs his father to buy him a copy of the Padma Puran and borrows books from his well off neighbors in exchange of watching over their fish pond every afternoon. His reading, as Gautam Bhadro has pointed out, is visceral, yielding bodily responses such as straining eyes, tears, a racing heart. He reads to imagine himself in faraway lands, among the travelers in the Probashi, and the Japanese folk tale in the Bongobashi, and the lurid warfare and romance in the novels. Later in his life, as an adult in Calcutta, Opu survives poverty and starvation while voraciously reading books from the library at Ripon College. When Opu reads, the world before him disappears and he finds himself somewhere else. He becomes someone else. Now, this paper is about female readers. And I begin, however, with the iconic male reader that is Opu to point to his reading, among other things, of the novel. In this section that I've just quoted here, Opu reads novels, he reads historical romances and plays, sensation tales from the secret genre that had taken off at the turn of the century in imitation of G.W.M. Reynolds' Mysteries series. Anindita Ghosh, in her work on the so called low life world of print at the Bottola presses in Calcutta, dubs the novel, among other forms, as women's literature, pointing to its significant patronage among female readers. Opu, and this is important to note, Opu reads without censure, beyond his mother's mild exasperation over burning their meager royal supply. Opu reads with the explicit indulgence of the authorial voice and the imagined reader of the novel. This lack of censure, I'd like to argue, constructs the ideal Bengali reader as a meritorious but poor Brahmin man, echoing the broader trope of the meritorious but poor Brahmin that has been adequately dismantled by scholars of caste. This lack of censure over his promiscuous forays into women's literature and the escape that it allows him from his everyday circumstances stands in sharp contrast with the fixed figure of the idle or the lazy female reader of the novel, among other forbidden genres, a figure who emerged as a figure of rhetoric in the 19th century. It is again quite beyond the scope of this discussion to adequately engage with the nuances of caste, class, religion that animates the construction of the figure of the female reader, ideal or ideal. But it would, however, suffice to state that my discussion today centers around Hindu women of dominant caste origin as readers and the vexed question of reading as a form of pleasurable escape from domestic responsibilities. The education of young women, or Kumari Shikha, is one of the many advice manuals published in the late 19th century for women. The author, one Nobin Kali Dashi, very difficult to track down who she was, tells her readers that the pleasure of your studies will remain with you your whole life. There will be no stage in your life when that pleasure will be inappropriate. There is no one with whom it must be shared. The you here is the writer's intended audience, young Bengali women of Hindu upper caste origins. It is unusual for an advice manual for women of the time to propose pleasure as an incentive for cultivating a reading habit. Pleasure, on the contrary, is a proposition that troubles most proponents of women's education, including those making a case for cultivating reading habits in women readers. Now, at this time, we must note that the expansion of education for women uh, through a combination of policy, reformist activity, and missionary action meant the inclusion of a greater number of literate women among the reading public. The expansion of print made available popular genres like the novel, kissas, farces, and so on to an even greater reading hearing public constituted by literate and non literate women alike, often not limited to upper caste women alone. The spread of this might be understood if one considers the poet administrator Nobin Chandra Sen's anecdote from the 1870s. He's on the screen in front of you here. He found his rural home in the farthest corners of Bengal, that is to say, in Noapara, Chittagong. He found it flooded with novels, sufficient to supplant the older practice of reading, hearing the Mongol Kabbos and the epics. Even the journeys by steamer, often marked by turbulent waters and dangerous cyclones, that Sen endured on his journeys back home, did not appear to prevent the circulation of the printed book to the distant Noapara. Sen writes, I realized that, and this is also on your screen, I realized that women's education had indeed shaken the foundations of this country. Novels have taken the place of sacred manuscripts. Sita has been replaced by Shurjamukhi. Ramchandra by Sitaram, Savitri by Kundanandini, Bipula by Bimala, Sri Krishna by Shottananda, Arjun by Jivananda. I'll offer another example. Biprodash Mukhopadhyay's invocation to his imagined female readers in his advice manual, in its hearty combination of moral logic and the rationality of modern medicine, is very characteristic of advice literature written at the time for women. He says, therefore, young ladies, rise awake and actively undertake the task assigned to you. Life is not a child's plaything. Life indeed is an invaluable possession. If you wish to possess good health, if you wish to become mothers and raise healthy children, then waste no more time. He even adds a stirring piece of doggerel, elaborating upon the troubles of a indolent existence. An idle existence is the cause of suffering. Forgive my very poor translation. There is little happiness in such life. Eternal ill health and a worried countenance makes for a sluggish body. His Jubati বা শ্রী জীবনের আদর্শ, the ideals of a young woman's or a wife's life, 1889, is one among the many advice manuals composed for the consumption of women in the last decades of the 19th century. The manual author's exhortations to his female readers to lead a life of activity is hinged upon a presumption of feminine penchant for indolence, a modern illness that, in the hyperbolic assertions of contemporary discourse, had taken on epidemic proportions among the newly educated upper caste women of colonial Bengal and swept through the upper caste Antapurs, wreaking havoc as women abandoned their domestic duties in favor of devouring popular novels and plays. The ties between modernity, textuality, and the feminine contraction of idleness is made abundantly clear in passages like the one I'll read out for you, where the author draws upon a commonsensical understanding of women's preferences in modern households. He says that these days, young women are increasingly in the grasp of a particular error. They have developed a preference for reading plays and novels, watching theatrical performances, and sitting idle like an inert object. They will rather decorate the house like a doll than concentrate upon their household tasks. What then is the problem posed by the possibility of a pleasurable escape that reading offers to women readers, as we see with Mukhopadhyay or with Nobin Chandra Sen, that this seems to be a problem? To understand that, we must dwell on the anxiety and the moral panic generated by the specter of the woman reader as a passive consuming subject. I will briefly, therefore, consider the ubiquity of the printed book as a consumer object and the feminization of consumption in 19th century Bengali discourse. Now, an advertisement in the Calcutta Gazette, which is dated 7th October 1784, advertises an elegant collection lately arrived from London, including rum from Jamaica, gin from Netherlands, cognac brandy, English linens, a wide variety of hats, gold-plated walking sticks, boxes, desks, trunks, mattresses, optical and mathematical instruments, musical instruments, and of course, printed books and newspapers, including the complete set of Churchill's voyages, adorned with copper plates and volumes, 8 volumes folio, among others. Now, books, it should be noted, much like any other consumer product of the empire, occupied a pride of place in such elegant collections, signifying taste, sophistication, and class. At the end of the 18th century, which is when this advertisement is from, Colonial Calcutta was a rapidly growing city, far outpacing the growth of other British presidencies in Bombay and Madras. The growing European population of the city found the need to maintain a luxurious standard of living, amply assisted by the cheap availability of Indian labor, as well as the enterprising European retailers who set up shop in the city. Stephen Hornsby, for instance, has shown that the European retailers were mostly confined around what is the Lal Dikhi, with an offshoot into Lal Bazar. While the majority of the European owned businesses were tied to wholesaling, the retailers also made a lot of money. So, for instance, Emma Roberts' account of the European retailers in 1837 referred to large and handsome jewelry shops, the magnificent establishment that was Thacker and Co., the city's main bookseller, and of course, at least half a dozen French and English milliners, hat makers of note. The English retailers did not simply cater to the European population, but to the native elite as well. As Christopher Bailey has pointed out, European traders in the late Mughal period breached Oriental patterns of consumption by catering to the insatiable desire of India's rulers for novelties, which would lead to the establishment of trade routes and commercial connections for the sale of clocks, china menageries, mirrors, and elaborate embroidery, which were later adapted to supply aristocratic taste in cloth and finally help create a mass demand for imported textiles. Such novelties represented the ruler's power, their connections with realms far and wide. The expansion of the British East India Company's business in India in the late 18th and the early 19th centuries meant, furthermore, a substantial shift in the material culture of the new Indian elite. Even as sections of the existing aristocracy found itself in decline, the newer elite, often aligned with the company, emerged. The contemporary response to the sea of exotic objects and the dazzling material culture of Calcutta was a mix of fascination and derision, combined with concerns over caste purity and pollution. The expansion of print in the early 19th century opened the gateways for a considerable body of writing featuring the Bengali Babu as the epitome of decadence and luxury, in violation of existing codes of caste and religion, and a hedonistic surrender to the emerging consumer culture of the time. In Uttam Peta's Noksha, for example, a piece of searing satire, women are often objects of consumption in the city. In the narrative's reiteration of the Babu's women, the Noch girls, the women of Shonagachi, despite their absence, incidentally, as protagonists in his vignettes, the presence of women as objects of consumption in the figure of the Kamini, that is to say, the embodiment of lust, in her many avatars, is in fact a significant one in this body of writing discussing the uh, decadence of the city and the Babu. Um, it's interesting, it allies her with the lure of the city's burgeoning consumer economy and conspicuous consumption. I draw my cues here in this discussion from the work of Shumit Sarkar, who has briefly addressed the feminization of consumption in 19th century Bengal in his essay investigating the appeal of Sri Ramakrishna Paramhamsa's teachings. Sarkar offers observations on the consuming female subject as a key target of what he calls Kolijug literature from the low-life Bortola presses. He says that pride of place now went to the modern wife, allegedly ill treating her mother in law, enslaving the husband, and wasting money on luxuries for herself. The evil of waged labor, one that forces the salaried worker into unbearable subservience in the colonial workplace, occupies a significant space in the Paramhamsa's thought. This evil is inevitably linked with the Kamini and Kanchun. In Shumit Sarkar's words again, wives with their luxurious ways instill into their husbands a lust for money, and this in turn forces men into office work. The low farces and tracts speak frequently of this. They speak of the clerk's subservience to alien masters at the colonial workplace and to the wife at home. This commentary on Kamini and Kanchun thus acquired a specific late 19th century resonance, as Shorkar says, even though they draw upon age old ideas about women, gold, and lust. Shubit Shorkar speaks of the Kamini, who in this case is consumption personified, a modern ailment made possible by the colonial economy and the luxuries it makes available for her consumption, from cosmetics to printed textiles, even as she herself is available, even as she herself is consumed in the city's consumer economy. The anonymous pamphlet titled Novel Heroine, it has no date and one assumes it reads as one that is from the late 19th century. It explicitly frames the modern woman's consumption of books, the popular romantic novel to be specific, as the source of both social and financial decline, as Horodev, the long suffering husband of the novel crazed heroine Rukmini, urges the imagined male audience slash reader that spending your hard earned money and encouraging this mad craze for useless romances, please do not make beasts out of human beings. The printed book, as one of the many luxuries afforded by the consumer economy of the city, becomes representative of women's consuming habits, suspicious and dangerous for the erotic excess they represent, and the easy association of the consuming wife with the Kamini, whose place in the city of spectacles is as an object of consumption as the Noch girl or the prostitute or the actress in the public theatre. Advice literature for women inserts itself in this discourse, centering around the overwhelming concern for women's practices of consumption time and again, beginning with the book and extending itself to food and objects of luxury. Kumari Shikha, Nobin Kalidashi's advice manual, published in 1883, is merely one among the scores of advice manuals for women that sought to insert themselves into the discourse centering on women's education and reading habits. For example, Dhirendranath Pal's Strir Shohit Kathopokathon, that is to say, Conversations with the Wife, published 5 years later in 1888, is structured in the form of a dialogue between a fictional husband and his wife, drawing upon the dialogic tradition of the Hitopadesh and the oral registers of a culture of reading hearing in the domestic sphere. The husband figure in this manual might be the epitome of an enlightened modern man, from his frank discussion of sexual relationship between a husband and a wife to his emphasis on the element of companionship that is essential to a modern marriage. He's not opposed to reading. He doesn't even dislike novels, but he approves of them in a certain way. Let me read this out. It is very important to read books in a selective fashion. Reading bad books is a waste of time and does not in fact serve to harm the reader, does in fact serve to harm the reader, then assist them in any manner. One must not touch bad books. Elsewhere, the husband figure speaks of the importance of female education for the purpose of running a household, not to mention for the noble purpose of self improvement. In his words of promise, reading and writing is more for the benefit of yourself. There is a promise, in fact, of sovereign selfhood in the husband's words. The modern woman's self formation, however, it's stated outright at the beginning, cannot be equivalent to that of a man. In this Shongshar, he tells us, the woman's purpose is one and the man's purpose is another. So, similar education for both men and women can only cause harm, not help. There is a certain dissatisfaction with the curriculum available. This is something that a lot of Pal's historical readers would have been exposed to. It's a gap that the manual writer seeks to step into with valuable words of information for women and husbands who seek to educate and reform them. And the stated purpose here is, of course, equality. You must understand how important it is for the husband and the wife to be equals, because it is only when they are equals that they can be companions. There is therefore a promise of sovereign selfhood, A promise held in the domain of textuality and knowledge that the modern woman just has to reach out towards and grasp. This benefit of the self is mostly of a benign and utilitarian nature. It is self improvement through judicious and selective reading practices rather than pleasure that is the end goal of the manual. But there remains an uncomfortable glimpse of something more, the possibility of non selective reading, of a self that rejects the benefit of self improvement and glories in an excess of pleasure, reads as voraciously as the young Opu whom we encountered earlier. Advice manuals advocating proper reading habits are surfeit, therefore, with images of deviant bodies. There are the thin or the illness prone bodies of modern women, which are products of poor learning and sitting stationary out of laziness, of illicit daytime siestas, and losing all sense at the sight of a Roshogolla. There are vain bodies, pouting in disgust and despair at the thought of illnesses, dirty clothes, sully and hardened hands, eyes filled with smoke, skin burning in heat. There is the desiring body, secretly reading novels and plays in a fit of desire. There is the recurring, haunting image of the body that is idle, sitting in an armchair and weaving a carpet, or reading the Meghnad Bodh Kapo, in sharp contrast to her husband, who sits in her study and works. She sits inertly like a doll and adds to the household's aesthetic beauty. She lies in bed reading a newspaper. The idle female reader, by the way of her impertinent absorption in books, her voracious appetite and promiscuous reading, poses a problem that a promiscuous male reader like the aforementioned Opu possibly cannot. The disruptive bodies of consuming women hover like spectres on the periphery of this discourse, pitching into fits of feminine hysterics, dabbling in dangerous discourses of love, and displaying through their sheer idleness an autonomy that is rooted in the corporeal body and its desire to rest, its desire to escape the routine of everyday domestic life. The woman reader, seeking pleasurable forms of escape from her domestic duties, becomes no less than the hedonist babu about town, heading into the night in search of forbidden fruits. She is in fact more dangerous because upon her rests the sanctity of the society at large. Duruba Mitro has pointed to the fact that for the lay social analyst of the time, every woman had the potential to become sexually deviant, and it was perpetual surveillance in the institution of heterosexual monogamous marriage that would save women from their otherwise inevitable fall. The fear of deviant womanhood, often articulated in the figure of the prostitute as the Bhadramohila's other, runs rife in these advice manuals that advocate judicious reading. Now, Kumari Shikha, again to come back to this particular advice manual, in its promise of pleasure to the young readers, lays bare the risks of reading. In many ways, it is a very conventional advice manual, exhorting female readers against idleness and teaching them the value of time. However, the author explains the significance of reading for pleasure at length. The promise of pleasure begins at first with the pleasure of attaining a skill. This is a delight of self improvement, attained through rigorous effort. The discussion of pleasure, however, then extends further as the author considers the pleasure of playing. In this, Nobin Kali takes on the familiar spectre of the child's play as an obstacle to mastering the art of diligent effort making that haunts the pages of Bengali primers of the era, which uh, contain the famous aphorism, Lekhapora kore je, gari ghora chore sei. That is to say, he who reads and writes would be able to afford vehicles to ride on them in the first place and therefore have a life of social mobility. But Nobin Kali's exhortations to her young readers blurs the firm distinction between work and play, found in a text like, say, Borno Porichoy, embodied by the twin figures of Gopal and Rakhal. Nobinkali Dashi's readers are female readers whose access to the world of childhood and a child's play are curtailed in the first place. She writes, and when you grow up, you won't be able to play because you won't have time to spare, and as a result, you won't be able to enjoy yourself anymore. Nobin Kalidashi's gentle conflation of growing up with the loss of play echoes that of Rashundari Dashi, who begins her memoirs with an anecdote of a playful childhood, only to conclude that following her marriage, so ended my days of playing in the dust. There was no more play after that. I only worked. Rashundari herein speaks in the voice of countless young brides in 19th century India who found themselves abruptly thrust into sexual awakening, at times with devastating consequences, at puberty, and along with it, adult responsibilities, from child's play to a woman's work. In Kumari Shikha's scheme of pleasure, the pleasure of a child's play can be compensated by the pleasure of an adult's reading. Because the pleasure of your studies, she says, will remain with you your whole life. There will be no stage, and it's again on the screen in front of you. There will be no stage in your life when that pleasure will be inappropriate. There is no one with whom it must be shared. The narrator's voice, with all the moral authority of the writer of an advice manual, promises that there will be no stage in your life when that pleasure will be inappropriate, thereby discarding the possibility of stigma or shame. For Nobin Kalidashi, reading is a pleasure that is never inappropriate and never at risk of being under siege at any point in one's life, regardless of one's household responsibilities and the ties of kinship or blood. Even mourning for a son, she says, has no effect on it. What remains unspoken is the possibility of a flight, of breaking an even greater tie, that between the husband and the wife, the fulcrum upon which rests the sanctity of caste Hindu society. The promise of a lifetime of pleasurable reading, an uncomfortable proposition of a bond between the female reader and her book, one that might mark the greatest escape of them all. One might recall again the anxious hyperbole from Robin Chandra Sen. Women's education has shaken the very foundations of the country. I'm drawing to a close now. Uh, in a 1929 text called "The Confessions of an Educated Prostitute," Shikhito Patitar Attocharit, published under the pseudonym Manoda Devi, the protagonist leaves the security of the Ondor Mahal for school and succumbs to her bodily passions. Now, it is difficult to tell, no, near impossible to tell if the Manoda Devi is indeed a woman. It is suspected that it is a male author writing under the pseudonym of Manoda Devi. Uh, Coincidentally, this is the same year as the publication of Pother Pachali. Opu's reading for escape leads him to a wide open world of possibilities. Opu's sister Durga, on the other hand, the girl who teaches him to imagine, she can only find an escape in death. In Manuda's world, the pleasure of reading becomes sexual pleasure, reading to sexual deviance and fall. Her only possible escape can only be outside the bounds of polite society. Kumari Shikha's unusual promise of reading for a pleasurable escape allows us to explore the contradictions posed by the expansion of women's education and changing cultures of reading hearing in colonial Bengal. Now, it is not my intention to suggest that Kumari Shikha proposes radical subversion of existing sexual morality, far from it. As an advice for, and manual for young women seeking to cajole and entice its young readers towards a habit of reading and writing, Kumari Shikha, through its promises, reflects the culture of reading hearing among Bengali women that already takes the pleasure of the book as part and parcel of its attraction. I'll pause my discussion here and thank you very much again for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moitra. That was a very interesting talk. I was wondering if anyone has any question, but probably there would be questions later on. This will stay saved. I was just wondering, you probably have covered that area. So, was there any particular kind of reading that was not? No, I mean, let me just rephrase that. How did they differentiate between the not so pleasurable um, kind of reading, or what kind of contents were they looking if it was not categorized as pleasure reading per se?
Uh, the idea that we get from the advice manuals seems to suggest that uh, they are not even it's very curious, because what the impression one gets is that they are sort of walking a tightrope regarding what they can recommend to women, what and you know, as writers of advice manuals, there and advice manuals that are trying to sell things, they too are under a pressure to be somewhat pleasurable and approachable in their reading. Like the whole dialogic structure drawn from the Hitopadesh is for a reason. It's meant to be accessible and at least somewhat pleasurable to their readers. But again, to go back to your, so this is a very difficult thing for them to navigate. But what they seem to be suggesting is that uh, while while the practice of reading should definitely be cultivated, and they are not denying the possibility of pleasure in judicious reading of good books, say something like a biography or even a selective reading of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's novels, the fear seems to be of passive consumption and uncritical reading, where the pleasure of the body, which of course reads on to sexual pleasure and sexual defiance, the fear seems to be that that will take place, that will overcome the female reader. And honestly, one gets a sense that after a certain point they are discovering reading for this sort of, this ostensible sexual pleasure, etc., in any sort of reading that women might do, because one of the things that they fear most is the specter of the woman sitting alone and reading silently, doing God knows what. Even though we should be very clear that the most common practice of reading hearing in the Bengali Antapur was not the silent reading, but the practices of communal reading that women would practice together, because it would involve groups of women, many of whom were semi literate or non literate. So this would be the primary practice of reading in the Antapur, as opposed to the silent reader reading God knows what in her bedroom. But that seems to be a fundamental place of fear. And so therefore, what does non-pleasurable reading look like? The answer to that is they don't know, because every kind of reading, even they, I mean, apart say from prescribed texts like Shushila Rupokhan, etc., every kind of reading always already has the potential of plunging into something inappropriate. So even if they must recommend reading because it is a good habit that women must cultivate in this modern society, it is also always something to be afraid of. I know this answer is contradictory, but I hope I've been able to get across my point to you.
Oh yes, I definitely reminded me of Charulata. Anyway, so we have some questions. I'll put that on screen. Can you see it
I can
now?
see Akshat's question. Should I read them out?
Yeah, sure. Because, or I could read it out, whatever
No, let me read
you.
it out. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Akshat. I'm very grateful you're here. So Akshat asks, he says that you've extensively pointed out how women readers were imagined or represented, mostly from a didactic lens and fear of social transgression. But what about the readers themselves? And this is a very good question. Thank you. Have you found any evidence of letters or memoirs, etc., which could indicate what the readers themselves thought of the act of reading or their reaction to specific texts? So, and yes, I'll go to the next section of the question later. So, yes, Akshat, I have, though a lot of this feels like, to be very honest, a lot of this feels like, hunting for needles in a haystack. But I have, in fact, found there are a lot of women readers who do speak of. mostly. And you can and it is of course, it should be noted again that these are women primarily from a privileged section of the society, either upper caste Hindu women or Muslim women of the station of Ruqayya Shakhawat Hussain, or somebody like Toru Dutt, a Christian convert, but also extremely elite. So it is primarily these narratives that we manage to get hold of. And there we do, for instance, one of my favorite anecdotes of this sort is from a lady called Kolashwashini Devi, whose memoirs are probably, they were not even memoirs, they were diaries that she wrote, and that she was probably hoping to write for publication, because there are references to readers, but it's not very clear. But anyway, one of the reasons I like it, because she says that in the days that my husband wasn't around, her husband would, he was a district magistrate and would frequently travel. So in the, and he would take her along to the district headquarters, leave her there with the daughter, and then travel further interiors. So she writes about the fact that, in those days when my husband wasn't there, I was like Robinson Crusoe, and she misspells Robinson Crusoe. She calls him Robinson Kurush. So in those days, I was like Robinson Kurush, reading, writing, doing my embroidery, and looking after my daughter, which I think points to some very interesting things about reading. She also talks about discussing Bankim Chandra novels with a friend of hers, though not in detail. You get glimpses of this in other women as well. For instance, women who talk about um, subscribing to magazines or waiting for them to arrive in the libraries of rural Bengal, of the because private libraries were by individual householders was quite common if they are of a elite background. You see this in, for instance, when Swarna Kumari Devi, Rabindranath Tagore's older sister and a writer editor in her own right, uh, talks about the bookseller, the female bookseller who arrived, who came into the women's Antor Mahal, and she talks about the excitement in the Antor Mahal, and she gives this whole list of books that the women of the household gathered from this, all sorts of kissas, novels, etc., the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the Mongol Kabbos, etc., staples alongside these, of course. So, a pretty diverse collection, and it was a matter of immense excitement for the book vendor to arrive. We also find similar, some of the most detailed anecdotal evidence of reading is from Toru Dutt herself. Though I should point out that Toru Dutto, being Toru Dutto, and given her particular location in society, both in terms of the fact of her elite background as well as the fact that she was mostly socially isolated in Calcutta owing to her Christianity, places her in this unique position. But we do have considerable evidence, even from the body of work that we have, of women readers talking about their reading practices. And there you you can tell that these prescriptions of appropriate reading aren't really working, because sure, they will also echo that yes, it's important to be judicious, etc. Nobody's going to say that we definitely we are wasting our time. Nobody of course admits to it. In fact, in another anecdote, Kolani Dotto, where she did a lot of ethnographic work and collected anecdotes from women who had grown up in the turn of the century, uh, there a lot of women delicately forget who had given them a book of kissas, for instance. So uh, there is very much this sense that some things are best left unspoken, but you do get a feeling that the advice manuals are basically trying to plug a gap into what is basically a sea. And the question of, and they're simply trying to contain practices that are always already there. That's the sense I get. The second part of Akshat's reading, distinction in language. Now, were English novels were considered transgressive in the same vein as Bangla? And the answer to this is very simple. Most readers at this point, most women readers at this point, don't have access to English novels. They read them in translation, of course. For instance, Kolashwashini Devi. I'm not sure which edition of Robinson Crusoe she read, but the fact that she is familiar with the name Robinson Kurush suggests that she has probably read something in translation. So yes, they would probably have access to translated abridged editions, especially by the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. But most women readers would not have access to English novels in the first place. Toru Dutt or Rokeya Shakhawat Hussain, who loves Marie Corelli, for example, these are exceptions. And so the question of reading transgressive English novels doesn't really come up in this preoccupied world. It's really Bengali literature that they're mostly concerned with. And I hope that's also answered your question.
Thank you so much, Shati Di. I guess we don't have any more questions. Okay, so this is going to stay archived and we can keep watching this later on as well. And if they have any question, it's going to be written in that comment section and we could get back to you again. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. And on that note, I guess we could sign off then. Have a nice weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.